Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's darkest corners, where maternal love twisted into something unrecognizable, and crowns were worth more than cradles. Picture this. It's a cold morning in 613 AD, and somewhere in the Frankish kingdom, a grandmother is holding her newborn grandsons. But instead of cooing lullabies, she's calculating their deaths. These aren't just any babies, they're princes, heirs to thrones, and in her mind, they're obstacles that need removing. Tonight we're exploring 5 medieval queens who made the ultimate sacrifice for power, except the sacrifice wasn't their own lives, was their children's. So if you're into strange and fascinating tales from history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Our first stop takes us to the blood-soaked courts of early medieval Europe, where Queen Brunhild of Austrasia earned her place in history, not just as a ruler, but as a grandmother willing to drown her own flesh and blood for political gain. Brunhild wasn't born into this darkness. She started as a Visigothic princess, married off to strengthen alliances like so many royal women of her time. But when her husband Sigurd was assassinated in 575, something fundamental shifted inside her. She'd already lost one son to political machinations, and now she found herself regent for her grandson Childebert II. The Frankish kingdoms were notorious for their brutal succession laws. Essentially, any male with royal blood could stake a claim, which meant family trees regularly pruned themselves through violence. By 613, Brunhild had survived 4 decades of court intrigue, outlasted multiple assassination attempts, and watched kingdoms rise and fall like wheat in a storm. She was in her 70s, ancient by medieval standards, but her grip on power remained iron-tight. The problem was biological. Her family line had multiplied, creating multiple potential heirs who represented multiple potential. The specific incident that earned Brunhild her infamous reputation involved her great-grandsons, the infant sons of Theudebert II. When Theudebert died in battle, these babies represented legitimate claims to the throne, but they also represented chaos. Medieval succession wasn't just about bloodlines. Brunhild had seen this pattern destroy kingdoms before contemporary chronicle, particularly those of Fredegar, paint a chilling picture of what happened next. Brunhild ordered the infants brought to her private chambers under the pretense of a blessing ceremony. What occurred there depends on which source you trust, but the outcome was consistent. 2 baby princes entered those chambers alive and emerged as corpses. The method, according to most accounts, was drowning, a deliberately chosen technique that left no obvious wounds and could be explained as accidents. Medieval infanticide often employed drowning because it mimicked natural deaths and was harder for political enemies to prove as murder. Brunhild allegedly used a ceremonial basin, the same type used for royal baptisms, turning a symbol of Christian salvation. But here is where the story gets even darker. Brunhild didn't just kill these children on impulse. She planned it methodically, understanding that living heirs would eventually grow into threats. Medieval queens rarely had the luxury of emotional decisions. Every choice carried dynastic weight. These weren't crimes of passion, but calculated political moves, as cold and deliberate as any military campaign. The immediate aftermath was surprisingly muted. Royal infanticide, while shocking, wasn't unprecedented. In early medieval Europe, the Byzantine Empire had normalized the practice centuries earlier, and Frankish nobility understood the brutal mathematics of cession. Brunhild's supporters saw her actions as protecting the realm from civil war, while her enemies filed away the information. What's particularly fascinating is how Brunhild justified these murders to herself and others. Medieval Christian theology struggled with infanticide, but political theology offered loopholes. Queens weren't just mothers. They were God's appointed guardians of kingdoms. If preserving the realm required sacrificing children, even royal children, then perhaps divine will demanded such sacrifices. The ripple effects of Brunhild's infanticide shaped Frankish politics for years. By eliminating rival claimants, she temporarily stabilized her power base, but she also created a precedent that haunted medieval succession law. Future queens would remember that even grandmothers' love had limits when crowns were at stake. Medieval chroniclers, writing decades later, struggled with how to categorize Brunhild's actions. Was she a monster who violated natural law, or a pragmatic ruler who made impossible choices? The answer probably lies somewhere between those extremes, in the grey moral territory where medieval queenship operated. Scholars today debate whether Brunhild's infanticide was exceptional or part of a broader pattern of royal violence that simply wasn't well documented. Medieval record-keeping was inconsistent, and royal families had strong incentives to suppress evidence of internal murders. How many other queens made similar calculations but left no chronicles behind? The technical aspects of medieval infanticide reveal the calculated nature of these crimes. Drowning left fewer traces than poison or smothering, and could be staged to look accidental. Royal infants were typically attended by wet nurses and servants who could be bought, threatened, or eliminated as witnesses. The logistics required planning, resources, and absolute confidence that the political benefits outweighed the risks. Brunhild's story also illuminates the impossible position of medieval queen mothers and grandmothers. Every royal birth created both joy and strategic complications. Too many heirs meant civil war, too few meant dynasty extinction. The mathematics of medieval kingship often demanded that someone die, and queens frequently found themselves choosing who. By 613, Brunhild had already outlived most of her contemporaries and accumulated enough political enemies to fill a small army. The infanticide of her great-grandsons bought her temporary security, but it also provided her opponents with powerful propaganda ammunition. When she was finally captured and executed later that year, torn apart by wild horses, according to chronicle accounts, her infant murders featured prominently in the list of charges against her. The broader context reveals medieval queenship as a role that regularly demanded impossible moral choices. These women weren't just mothers and wives, they were political operators managing kingdoms where personal and dynastic survival required constant calculation. Brunhild's willingness to murder her own descendants represents an extreme end of that spectrum, but perhaps not as extreme as modern sensibilities might suggest. Her story raises uncomfortable questions about power, family, and survival that echo through medieval history. How many other royal mothers faced similar calculations? How many chose differently, and what were the consequences? The silence in historical records might tell us more about medieval royal infanticide than the few documented cases ever could. While Brunhild's crimes played out in the muddy battlefields of Frankfurt, hundreds of miles south, another royal mother was contemplating an even more complex web of family murder. Constance of Hauteville had married into the most powerful dynasty in medieval Europe, Hohenstaufens, and by 1194 she found herself empress of both the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of Sicily. But empires built on marriage alliances were fragile things, and Constance discovered that sometimes the greatest threats came from within the family tree itself. Her husband, Emperor Henry VI, had died unexpectedly in 1197, leaving behind a 3-year-old heir named Frederick. Under normal circumstances, this would have triggered the standard medieval regency arrangement. Constance would rule until her son came of age, but nothing about Hohenstaufen politics was ever normal. The family had spent generations accumulating enemies, and a child emperor was like blood in shark-infested waters. What made Constance's situation particularly desperate was the existence of another son, Philip Henry's adult brother, who had legitimate claims to both the imperial title and the Sicilian crown. Medieval succession law was deliberately vague about situations like this, creating opportunities for ambitious relatives to press competing claims. Philip had military experience, adult judgment, and most importantly, he wasn't a toddler dependent on regents and advisors. But here is where the story takes its start. In 1198, a son named Conrad who represented an even more dangerous complication. 2 royal sons meant 2 potential civil wars, 2 sets of supporters, and 2 chances for the empire to tear itself apart. Medieval mathematics were brutally simple. 1 heir meant stability, multiple heirs meant chaos. The decision that earned Constance her place in our grim catalogue came during the winter of 1198. Contemporary sources from the Sicilian court describe a series of private meetings between the empress and her closest advisors, discussions that apparently centered on what modern political scientists would call succession management. The problem wasn't just that she had multiple sons, it was that keeping them all alive virtually guaranteed civil war. Medieval chroniclers, particularly the monk Richard of San Germano, provide disturbing details about what happened next. Constance arranged for her younger son, Conrad, to be brought to her private chambers for what was described as a blessings ceremony. But instead of prayers, the infant received a carefully measured dose of what contemporary sources describe as sweet sleep, almost certainly some form of opiate or herbal toxin that medieval physicians knew could stop a child's breathing without obvious violence. The method was sophisticated, revealing the calculated nature of Constance's decision. Medieval royal courts had access to considerable medical knowledge, including detailed understanding of poisons that could mimic natural childhood deaths. Infant mortality rates were so high in the 12th century that one more dead baby barely died. What makes Constance's story particularly chilling is the Constance's story perceived. Unlike many medieval royal murders, this one left paper trails, payment records to physicians, private letters between court officials, and even inventory lists of medicinal supplies that included substances with no legitimate medical purpose for treating children. Medieval bureaucracy, it turns out, sometimes documented its own crimes with embarrassing thoroughness. The immediate political results validated Constance's brutal calculation. With only one legitimate heir remaining, the succession question simplified dramatically. Philip of Swabia still posed a threat, but adult challenges to child emperors followed predictable patterns that experienced regents could manage. Multiple child heirs, by contrast, created exponentially more complex policy. In 1199, reports emerged from the imperial court suggesting that she had also eliminated several cousins' children of Henry VI's siblings who possessed distant but legitimate claims to various territories. Medieval family trees were dense with potential claimants, and thorough succession planning sometimes required extensive prunings. The technical aspects of these murders reveal sophisticated under-pruning. The technical aspects. Royal infanticide wasn't just about killing babies, it was about managing information, controlling witnesses, and creating plausible explanations that would satisfy both supporters and enemies. Constance employed court physicians who understood exactly which substances would produce which symptoms and exactly how to stage deaths that looked natural. Religious justification. Medieval Christianity struggled with infanticide, but it also emphasized divine appointment of rulers and the sacred duty to preserve kingdoms. If God had chosen her to rule Sicily and guide the empire, then perhaps eliminating threats to that divine mission was itself a form of religious obligation. Medieval queens regularly performed mental gymnastics. The broader strategic context reveals why Constance felt compelled to such extremes. The Hohenstaufen dynasty controlled territory stretching from northern Germany to southern Italy, but that empire was held together more by personality and intimidation than by stable instinctive challenge. Not just his relative. Contemporary accounts describe Constance as becoming increasingly paranoid during 1199 and 1200, apparently convinced that survival required eliminating any possible rival claimants. Medieval royal mothers often developed what we might recognize today as hypervigilance. Court records show payments for special burial preparations, suggesting that even infant victims of royal politics received ceremonial treatment. Medieval courts were nothing if not consistent. The gay murdered children with the same formal protocols they used for everything else. Scholars debate whether Constance's infanticide was exceptional. The dynasty had a reputation for eliminating inconvenient relatives, but most such murders targeted adults rather than children. Constance may have pioneered a more systematic approach to succession management, treating family members as strategic resources to be deployed or eliminated as circumstances required. Contemporary chroniclers describe her becoming increasingly isolated and suspicious, trusting fewer advisors and making more erratic political choices. Medieval royal women who committed infanticide often struggled with the psychological aftermath. Even when they remained convinced their actions were necessary, what's particularly striking about Constance's story is how it illustrates the intersection of personal and political calculation. In medieval queenship, she wasn't just a mother making emotional choices, she was an empress managing an empire where every decision carried dynastic consequences. The children she murdered weren't just her offspring, they were potential civil wars, potential foreign invasions, and potential dynasty extinctions. By 1200, Constance had successfully eliminated most immediate succession threats, but the psychological and political costs were mounting. Her remaining son, Frederick, was showing signs of the intelligence and ambition that would eventually make him one of medieval Europe's most formidable rulers. But he was also growing old enough to understand what had happened to his siblings, creating new layers of family tension and mistrust. The legacy of Constance's infanticide shaped Hohenstaufen politics for generations. Future family members understood that even maternal bonds had limits when imperial survival was at stake. The precedent she set, that queens would murder their own children to preserve dynastic stability, became part of the family's institutional memory. The Byzantine Empire had always operated by different rules than Western Europe, and by 797 AD, Those rules were about to produce one of medieval history's most shocking maternal betrayals. Empress Irene of Athens had clawed her way to unprecedented power in Constantinople, becoming the first woman to rule the Eastern Roman Empire in her own name rather than as regent. But her path to that throne was paved with a crime so brutal that even Byzantine chroniclers, accustomed to imperial violence, struggled to describe it without horror. She had deliberately and methodically blinded her own adult son to prevent him from reclaiming his rightful throne. The story begins in 780, when Irene's husband Leo RV died, leaving their 10-year-old son Constantine VI as emperor under her regency. Byzantine succession law was clearer than its Western counterparts. Legitimate male heirs took precedence, and regencies were meant to be temporary arrangements. But Irene had tasted imperial power, and she discovered that she had no intention of surrendering it when her son reached maturity. What makes Irene's case particularly complex is that Constantine VI wasn't an infant victim, but a grown man with his own political ambitions. I 790. He was 20 years old, married, and increasingly frustrated with his mother's refusal to cede actual authority. Byzantine emperors traditionally assumed full power around age 16, but Irene had spent a decade finding excuses to delay that transition. The tensions came to a head in 792, when Constantine attempted his first coup against his mother's regency. He had military backing from several theme commanders, who believed the young emperor deserved his birthright. But Irene had spent years building her own power network, and she crushed the rebellion with ruthless efficiency. The failed coup revealed a fundamental problem. Ardenti Constantine remained alive and unimpaired. He would continue attracting supporters who questioned female rule. Medieval chroniclers, particularly Theophanes, the Confessor, provide disturbing details about the psychological warfare that followed. Irene didn't immediately move to eliminate her son. Instead, she spent years undermining his credibility and isolating him from potential stability. Questioned his memos about his mental steponsibisi. The Byzantine court was a hothouse of rumor and intrigue, where perception often mattered more than reality. Irene understood that killing Constantine outright would create a martyr and potentially trigger civil war. But destroying his ability to rule, literally and figuratively, offered a more sustainable solution. Medieval political theory held that physical perfection was necessary for imperial legitimacy. A blind emperor was a contradiction in terms. The actual blinding took place on the 15th of August, 797, in the same purple chamber where Constantine had been born. Byzantine sources describe the event with clinical precision that somehow makes it more horrifying. Irene ordered her son brought to the imperial apartments under pretense of reconciliation, then had specially trained servants hold him down while court physicians destroyed his eyes with heated metal input. The choice of date wasn't coincidental. 15th of August was the Feast of the Assumption, when Christians celebrated the Virgin Mary's elevation to heaven. Irene apparently saw symbolic meaning in destroying her son's sight on a day dedicated to divine motherhood. Medieval rulers were obsessed with symbolic gestures, and this one sent a clear message about the lengths maternal ambition could reach. Byzantine blinding techniques were sophisticated and deliberately designed to ensure survival while eliminating political effectiveness. Court physicians knew exactly how to destroy vision without causing fatal infections or immediate death. The goal wasn't to kill Constantine, but to create a living demonstration that challenged Irene Ethylician apextrain consequences. What's particularly chilly in Ponston Patim Butts might just the chronicles describe her as remaining completely calm throughout the procedure, occasionally giving technical instructions to ensure the physicians did thorough work. She apparently treated her son's screaming as background noise, no more significant than construction sounds outside the palace. The immediate political aftermath validated Irene's brutal calculation, at least in the short term. Constantine's supporters melted away once news of his condition spread through Constantinople. Byzantine political culture couldn't accommodate a blind emperor, and most theme commanders quickly transferred their loyalty to Irene. The path was clear for her to become the first empress regnant in Byzantine history, but the psychological consequences apparently surprised even Irene. Later chronicles describe her becoming increasingly paranoid. Medieval royal women who committed extreme violence against family members often struggled with the emotional aftermath, even when they remained convinced their actions were politically necessary. The religious implications of Constantine's blinding created ongoing problems for Irene's legitimacy. Some contemporary sermons, carefully preserved in monastery libraries, describe Irene's actions as violations of natural law that threatened divine favor for the entire empire. Technical details about the blinding reveal the calculated nature of Irene's decision. She chose physicians known for precision, rather than court executioners, known for brutality, suggesting that she wanted her son to survive as a permanent reminder of the consequences. For Chalating, medieval political theatre often required living symbols rather than dead martyrs. The broader context of Byzantine politics helps explain why Irene felt compelled to such extremes. The empire faced external threats from Arabs, Bulgars, and Franks, while internal religious disputes over iconoclasm created additional pain. Eliminating Constantine wasn't just about personal power, it was about demonstrating the strength necessary to hold the empire together. Scholars debate whether Irene's blinding of Constantine was planned from the beginning or emerged as circumstances evolved. Some evidence suggests she had considered the option as early as 790, when Constantine's first coup attempt revealed the fundamental incompatibility to retain power. Medieval royal mothers often developed contingency plans for dealing with inconvenient children. Though few implemented them with Irene's methodical brutality, the international reaction to Constantine's blinding was swift and largely negative. Charlemagne in Francia used the incident as justification for claiming the imperial title, especially rule established through such violence infuriated Byzantine claims to Roman succession. Medieval diplomacy was always looking for pretexts, and maternal infanticide provided excellent propaganda ammunition. What makes Irene's story particularly disturbing is the clinical efficiency with which she executed her plan. This wasn't a crime of passion, but a carefully orchestrated political operation, complete with advanced planning, specialized personnel, and post-event management. She treated her son's blinding like any other imperial administrative task, delegating specific responsibilities and monitoring results. The long-term consequences extended far beyond Constantine's personal tragedy. Irene's precedent established that Byzantine empresses could and would use extreme violence to maintain power, creating expectations. Future royal mothers understood that even the most fundamental family bonds could be sacrificed for political necessity. Contemporary accounts describe Constantine living for several more years after his blinding, maintained an imperial luxury, but politically neutralized. He became a living symbol of his mother's ruthlessness and a constant reminder to potential challengers about the costs of opposing established authority. Medieval political theatre often required such permanent displays of power's consequences. The psychological profiles that emerge from Byzantine Chronicle suggest that Irene never expressed regret for blinding her son. She apparently viewed the action as necessary imperial business, no different from executing rebels or negotiating treaties. Medieval queenship sometimes required emotional compartmentation that modern ecology might classify as sociotic. Medieval queenship semi-Clive Ride Emotier. By 802, Irene's reign was ending, brought down not by guilt over Constantine's blinding, but by court conspiracies and military pressures that had nothing to do with her maternal crimes. She died in exile on Lesbos, still apparently convinced that destroying her son's sight had been the correct. Politely enjoyed the luxury of moral complexity. They made calculated choices and lived with the consequences, as Byzantine empresses were perfecting the art of blinding their own children. Far to the north, in the vast forests and steppes of Kievan Rus, a different kind of maternal horror was unfolding. Princess Olga of Kiev had earned her place in medieval chronicles as both a cunning political operator and a ruthless military strategist. But her darkest legacy involved the systematic sacrifice of her youngest children to pagan gods in exchange for military victory. Olga's path to infanticide began with her husband's brutal murder in 945. Prince Igor had been killed by the Drevlians, a Slavic tribe that refused to pay tribute to Kiev, and his death left Olga as regent for their 3-year-old son, Sviatoslav. But unlike the Christian empresses of Byzantium or Western Europe, Olga ruled in a world where pagan traditions still dominated political and spiritual life. The old gods demanded blood sacrifices, and royal children represented the most valuable offerings a ruler could provide. Medieval chroniclers, particularly the Primary Chronicle, compiled centuries later, to struggle to describe Olga's religious practices with the same clinical detail they applied to Christian royal violence. Pagan infanticide operated by different rules and different justifications than the political calculations that drove Byzantine or Frankish family murders. For Olga, killing her children wasn't just about eliminating succession threats, nay, was about purchasing divine favor for military campaigns against the Drevlians and other tribal enemies. The first documented sacrifice occurred in the winter of 946. During Olga's preparation for her famous revenge campaign against the Drevlians, contemporary pagan sources, preserved in later Orthodox compilation, describe elaborate rituals contained the previous year. daughters whose existence wasn't politically significant in a culture that prioritized male inheritance, but whose blood was considered especially potent, but whose blood was considered as Cruelest. The technical aspects of Slavic child sacrifice reveal sophisticated theological understanding of how to maximize spiritual benefits. Unlike Byzantine, blinding or Frankish drowning, pagan infanticide was designed to transfer the victim's life force to specific deities in exchange for specific favors. The ritual required precise timing, correct locutions, and proper ceremonial procedures. What makes Olga's story particularly complex is that she operated in a transitional period when Christian influences were beginning to penetrate Slavic royal courts. She was aware of Byzantine practices and Western European politics, but her spiritual wortray for her own children represented a deliberate choice to embrace traditional religious. Medieval pagan sources described the winter sacrifice ceremony with disturbing precision. Olga allegedly brought her twin daughters to a sacred oak grove during the darkest days of December, when Slavic theology held that the boundaries between mortal and divine worlds were thinnest. The ritual involved elaborate preparations, fasting purifications advisors, who specialized in determining which offerings would be most effective for specific military. The actual killings followed ancient protocols that had governed Slavic royal sacrifices for centuries. Unlike the political murders committed by Christian queens, these deaths were public ceremonies attended by court officials, military commanders, and religious specialists. The goal wasn't secrecy, but Maximus Spages had been followed and appropriate divine attention secured. Contemporary accounts describe Olga remaining emotionally controlled throughout the ceremony, apparently viewing her daughters' deaths as necessary investments in military success. Pagan theology didn't emphasize maternal bonds in the same way Christian theology did. Royal children were valuable resources that could be deployed for political, military, or spiritual purposes. The distinction between sacrificing enemy captives and sacrificing one's own offspring was less significant in cultures where divine favor was understood as transactional. The immediate military results seemed to validate Olga's spiritual calculations. Her revenge campaign against the Drevlians was devastatingly successful, culminating in the complete destruction of their capital city and the elimination of their leadership. Medieval pagan cultures interpreted military success as divine confirmation that previous sacrificial offerings had been acceptable and effective. But Olga's infanticide wasn't limited to the initial twin sacrifice. Archaeological evidence from burial sites near Kiev suggests that she continued practicing child sacrifice throughout the 940s, apparently offering younger children to different deities for different strategic purposes. Slavic paganism was polytheistic and specialized. Different gods controlled different aspects of royal authority, requiring correspondingly different types of sacrificial offerings. What's particularly striking about Olga's case is how it illustrates the intersection of religious belief and political pragmatism in pre-Christian Eastern Europe. She was a ruler implementing sophisticated theological strategies designed to maximize supernatural support for earthly military campaigns. The children she sacrificed weren't political threats. They were spiritual investments. The documented age, medieval pagan theology, provided detailed justifications for royal infanticide the Christian moral frameworks couldn't easily accommodate. Slavic religious traditions held that royal children possessed special spiritual potency because of their bloodline connections to divine authority. Sacrificing such children was considered more valuable than sacrificing equivalents. The broader context of Kievan politics helps explain why Olga felt compelled to such extreme religious measures. Her realm was surrounded by hostile tribes, Byzantine political influence, and competing Scandinavian interests that threatened Kiev's independence. Pagan rulers, in such circumstances, often concluded that conventional, material independence. Contemporary pagan sources describe Olga consulting with specialist priests who maintained detailed knowledge about which types of sacrifices were most effective for specific military objectives. These religious advisors apparently recommend child sacrifice as the most reliable method for securing divine support for major military campaigns. Medieval pagan courts employed religious spine sport. The psychological dimensions of Olga's infanticide remain largely opaque because pagan cultures didn't emphasize emotional introspection in the same way Christian cultures did. Available sources focus on ritual procedures and military outcomes rather than personal feelings or moral struggles. Archaeological findings from sacred sites near Kiev reveal the sophisticated infrastructure that supported Slavic royal sacrifice practices, specialized ceremonial locations, ritual implements, and burial procedures all suggest that child sacrifice was an institutionalized aspect of pagan royal thoroughness rather than impulsive criminalness. The religious transformation that eventually made Olga famous, her conversion to Christianity around 957, apparently involved explicit renunciation of previous sacrificial practices. Byzantine sources describe her confession and penance as focusing heavily on the children she had killed for pagan purposes. The psychological burden of infanticide may have contributed to her spiritual transformation, though contemporary sources emphasize pollution. What makes Olga's story particularly significant is how it illustrates alternative frameworks for understanding medieval royal infanticide. While Christian queens like Brunhild, Constance, and Irene murdered children for political reasons, pagan queens like Olga killed for explicitly religious purposes. The children weren't obstacles to be eliminated, but offerings to be maximized, requiring different moral calculations. The long-term consequences of Olga's sacrificial practices shaped Kievan royal culture for generations. Future rulers understood that traditional Slavic kingship included obligations to provide blood offerings when circumstances required divine intervention. By 955, Olga had apparently concluded that her sacrificial investments had achieved their intended purposes. The Drevlians were eliminated, Kiev's military position was secure, and her son Sviatoslav was old enough to begin assuming adult responsibilities. The practical need for child sacrifice had diminished, but the precedent remained embedded in royal institutional memory. The final entry in our catalogue of maternal horrors takes us to 14th century Portugal, where Queen Isabella of Aragon faced a dilemma that combined medieval medical ignorance with dynastic paranoia in the most tragic possible way. By 1336, Isabella had ruled alongside her husband King Dinis for nearly 4 decades, establishing Portugal as a rising power in Iberian politics and carefully managing the delicate balance between Christian kingdoms and Mauler 4 decades. But success bred its own problems, and the Queen found herself confronting a nightmare that would have been unthinkable to earlier generations. Her daughter, whose epileptic seizures were being interpreted by court physicians and religious advisors as evidence of supernatural corruption that threatened the entire royal bloodline. But by age 16, she had begun experiencing what medieval medicine could only describe as falling sickness, violent seizures that left her unconscious and convulsing. In an era when medical understanding was limited and supernatural explanations dominated, epilepsy was often interpreted as evidence of demonic possession, divine punishment, or hereditary corruption that could contaminate future generations. Medieval Portuguese court records, preserved in monastery archives, provide disturbing details about the theological and medical debates that surrounded Constanza's condition. Royal physicians consulted with university scholars from Salamanca and Coimbra. Religious astrologers analyzed celestial for signs of supernatural in tone. The unanimous conclusion was that Constanza's seizures represented a form of spiritual contamination that would inevitably be passed to any children she might bear. What makes Isabella's situation particularly tragic is that she genuinely loved her daughter, but found herself trapped by medieval beliefs about hereditary corruption. The pressure for definitive action intensified when marriage negotiations began for Constanza's betrothal to Pedro of Castile, a union that would have significant political implications for Portuguese, Castilian relations. Medieval royal marriages weren't just personal arrangements, but dynastic investments corrupted bloodlines into such strategic alliances, created diplomatic complications that threatened Portuguese foreign policy. Court physicians, led by Master Moni of Lisbon, provided Isabella with detailed medical opinions about the hereditary nature of epilepsy that reflected medieval understanding of how physical and spiritual corruption could be transmitted through bloodlines. These medical consultations, documented in royal archives, reveal sophistication, adaptations for optations of royal mothers to protect future generations from inherited contamination. The decision to eliminate Constanza wasn't made impulsively, but emerged from months of careful consultation with medical, religious, and political advisors who unanimously concluded that allowing her to reproduce would constitute a form of dynastic treason. Medieval royal mothers faced impossible choices when dynastic survival fitted with maternal instincts. But Isabella's case was particularly complex because it involved medical conditions that contemporary gnosis. The method Isabella chose reflected both her desire to minimize her daughter's suffering and her need to avoid creating evidence that could be used against the royal family by political enemies. Medieval Portuguese court records describe the procurement of specialized medicines, some Moorish physicians in Seville substances that were known to induce peaceful death while mimicking natural illness. The technical sophistication required to obtain and administer such poisons reveals the calculated nature of Isabella's decision. On the 15th of November, 1336, Princess Constanza died in her private chambers after what court physicians described as a sudden fever that quickly overwhelmed her weakened constitution. Contemporary accounts emphasize the princess's peaceful death and her mother's grief, but private correspondence between court officials reveals a more complex begin with. Isabella had apparently spent the final week administering carefully measured doses of poison that gradually weakened Constanza's system while avoiding the violent symptoms that might raise suspicions. The immediate aftermath demonstrated the sophisticated damage control that medieval royal courts could implement. Medieval royal families had extensive experience managing information about inconvenient deaths. What makes Isabella's story particularly poignant is the detailed documentation of her psychological struggle with the decision. Private letters to her confessor, preserved in monastery archives, reveal a woman torn between maternal love and dynastic duty. She apparently spent months seeking religious justification for what she was contemplating, consulting with theologians about whether it is demomity. Medieval Christian theology provided complex frameworks for understanding such moral dilemmas, but no clear answers. Some religious authorities argued that preventing the transmission of divine punishment to future generations was itself a form of Christian charity. Others maintained that only God could determine which bloodlines deserved continuation. The broader medical context reveals how medieval ignorance about neurological conditions created impossible situations for royal families. Epilepsy was poorly understood and often conflated with supernatural possession. Hereditary who developed such conditions, royal children who developed such conditions. Portuguese court records document the extensive precautions Isabella took to ensure that Constanza's death wouldn't create political vulnerabilities. Foreign ambassadors were provided with detailed medical explanations. Domestic nobles received carefully crafted announcements. The international diplomatic implications were significant because Constanza's death eliminated a potentially valuable marriage alliance with Castile. Medieval royal daughters were strategic assets whose marriages could secure territorial agreements, military alliances, or economic partnership. Isabella's decision to sacrifice those diplomatic opportunities in order to protect future dynastic purements. Scholars today debate whether Isabella's fears about hereditary epilepsy had any medical validity or reflected purely superstitious medieval thinking. Modern genetics suggests that some forms of epilepsy do have hereditary components, though medieval understanding was obvious to it. The psychological toll of Constanza's murder apparently affected Isabella's later years significantly. Contemporary chronicles describe her becoming increasingly religious and withdrawn, spending more time in prayer and less time on court politics. Medieval royal women who committed infanticide often struggled with the emotional aftermath, particularly when religious belief systems emphasized maternal bonds and family obligation. What's particularly striking about Isabella's case is how it illustrates the intersection of medical ignorance and political pressure in medieval royal decision-making. She wasn't just a mother dealing with a sick child. She was a queen managing dynastic resources where medical conditions could have political consequences that extended far beyond individual family members. The children she was responsible for weren't just her offspring. They were potential diplomatic assets whose conditions could affect international relations. The documentation of Constanza's death provides unusual insight into the technical aspects of medieval royal poisoning. Court records reveal the specific substances used, the dosage schedules followed, and the careful monitoring required to ensure death appeared natural. Medieval royal courts maintained sophisticated capabilities for conducting such operations when political or dynastic circumstances required elimination of inconvenient family members. By 1340, Isabella had apparently achieved her primary objective, protecting the Portuguese royal bloodline from what she perceived as supernatural contamination. Her surviving children continued without the medical complications that had threatened its future. From a purely dynastic perspective, her decision to sacrifice Constanza had been strategically successful. The broader legacy of Isabella's infanticide shaped Portuguese royal culture's approach to managing family members with medical or psychological conditions. Future generations understood that royal mothers would sacrifice children whose conditions threatened dynastic interests. Medieval queenship sometimes required choices that contradicted every maternal instinct, but served longer-term political necessities. The religious dimensions of Isabella's decision continued influencing Portuguese court culture long after her death. The precedent she established that queens could and would eliminate children whose contes threatened dynastic purity became part of royal institutional memory. Medieval families learned to view medical conditions not just as personal tragedies, but as political problems requiring political solutions. As the wind picks up outside these ancient Portuguese walls, we can almost hear the whispers of medieval mothers who faced impossible choices. These 5 women, separated by centuries and continents, shared a common understanding that sometimes preserving kingdoms required destroying the children who might inherit them. Their stories illuminate the darkest corners of medieval royal life, where crowns came with prices that modern sensibilities can barely comprehend. Their children's voices, silenced by political necessity and maternal calculation, echo through the centuries as reminders that power's ultimate cost is often measured in the smallest gravestains. Now knowing that these medieval mothers did what they believed necessary to preserve the kingdoms that shaped our world, even when preservation required the ultimate sacrifice, the bonds that should have been most sacred, the crowns they wore were heavy with more than gold and jewels. They carried the weight of impossible decisions that no mother should ever have to make, but that medieval queens made anyway, because sometimes love meant letting go in the most final way possible. Sweet dreams, and remember that history's most powerful women often paid prices that we can glimpse only in the quiet moments between sleeping and waking, when the boundaries between past and present grow thin enough to hear the whispered apologies of mothers who chose kingdoms over cradles.